Hello, everyone. The Celebrity Estates podcast will be taking a short break for the holidays, so our next two releases will be classic episodes, handpicked from the most popular ones of the past year. Never fear, however, we'll be back with all new content in the new year starting January 17th. Until then, have a happy holiday and enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by wealthmanagement.com senior editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of wealthmanagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that can just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. Our guest this week is Dr. Denise Federer. She's the owner and founder of Federer Performance Management Group, LLC in Tampa, Florida. She uses her extensive cognitive behavioral training and expertise in stress management, health and welfare issues, different communication styles, performance enhancement, and motivational strategies for behavioral change in her coaching and consulting work with individuals, teams, and corporations. As a natural outgrowth of her interests, Dr. Federer is an expert in the unique dynamics of closely held and family businesses, as well as strategies for improving workplace interactions to maximize both financial success and increase job satisfaction. Thanks for joining us, Denise.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So the subject of this episode is one my wife is actually very excited about. It's an icon of Hollywood's golden age, Audrey Hepburn. Hepburn rose to stardom in the romantic comedy Roman Holiday in 1953, alongside Gregory Peck, and he became a lifelong friend. And she was the first actress to win an Oscar, a Golden Globe, and a BAFTA for a single performance that year. In that same year, Hepburn won a Tony Award for Best Lead Actress in a Play for her performance in On 9. She went on to star in a number of successful films, such as Sabrina, in which Humphrey Bogart and William Holden compared for her affections, Funny Face, a musical in which she sang her own song parts, the drama The Nun Story, the romantic comedy Breakfast at Tiffany's, the thriller romance Charade, opposite Cary Grant, and the musical My Fair Lady. In 1967, she starred in the thriller Wait Until Dark, receiving Academy Award, Golden Globe, and BAFTA nominations. After that, she disappeared a little bit and only occasionally appeared in films, one being Robin and Marion in 1976 with Sean Connery. Her last recorded performances were in the 1990 documentary television series Guardians of the World with Audrey Hepburn. She's also one of only 16 people to win Academy, Emmy, Grammy, and Tony Awards, the much-desired EGOT for 30 Rock fans out there. Hepburn sadly passed in 1993 after a brief fight with a rare strain of abdominal and colon cancer. She was survived by two sons, one with first husband, actor Mel Ferrer, and the other with second husband, Italian psychiatrist Andrea Dotti. Her estate left the contents of a storage locker just stuffed with Hollywood memorabilia to be split 50-50 between the two sons. But if only things were that simple, right? A fight immediately kicked off between the two stepbrothers over how to evenly distribute the contents of their mother's storage locker. This fight lasted 24 years. It simmered between the two for decades before becoming a legal issue finally in 2015, and ultimately the two allowed a judge to settle it for them in 2017. So now this case features a pair of items that we've covered before in this show quite a bit, namely how difficult it can be to define what even distribution means, such as in the Tom Petty case. And of course, that step-family will often fight, which is basically every other episode of the show. However, we've largely tackled that second issue in terms of step-parents not getting along with their step-children. So today we're going to talk a little bit about sibling rivalry, what causes it, be it between full or step-siblings, and how advisors can attempt to plan around it. So Dr. Federer, with all that being said, let's start with the not-so-simple question of what are some of the most common causes of sibling rivalry?
Okay, well, that is a great question. And in listening to Audrey Hepburn's story, I'm personally a fan of the golden era of Hollywood. It's so sad to me what happened in that family, but it's pretty typical. And I would say the number one thing that I see that causes sibling rivalry is the lack of honest conversations initiated by parents. It's so important to actually have transparent communication in families, particularly families of wealth. But often the disputes that siblings have is really not, believe it or not, about the money, but it's about what things mean and about those. And if you think about that storage locker of memorabilia, it's what it meant to their mother, and feeling that sense of pain and loss because they didn't have that conversation about what she really wanted and what things meant. So much of that could be mitigated if people could start early having difficult conversations about money, their legacy, what matters, and what they want to have happen when they're gone.
Yeah, and it's important to note, like, before everyone rolls their eyes at, oh, just communicate, that a
Yeah.
lot of these things, when you're dealing with sort of sentimental value, which is a lot of what we're talking about here, that's just not something you can properly plan for on paper or in a contract. That's something that has to be talked out over time because you just never know. And a lot of times these kids don't even know until they're right in it.
I have a great story of one of the cases I worked with a family. This family was very wealthy, and the mom was trying ahead of time to start going through her things and share them with the three children that she had. And of all her antiques and all the valuable possessions, they all wanted to fight over these Flintstone glasses that they got at a gas station back in the 70s. They used to give it away when you had gas. When you got gas, you'd get a glass. And every year at Christmas, after they finished putting the star on the tree, she'd break out the eggnog and these glasses, and they would all celebrate Christmas. That was the thing all three of the children wanted, were those six glasses, because it reminded them of their memories of growing up. So it goes to show you that and she was shocked, by the way. She had no idea the kids her adult children had placed so much value, but it represented so much to them. And without conversation, you just don't know what's important to your children and how it's going to impact them and what it means to them.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of the case of Robin Williams, which we kind of talked about on, I think, the second episode of the show, actually, where, of all his millions of dollars and all of his, things, that his family ended up sort of fighting a little bit over, like, his bicycle collection. Like, it was just like this weird, because they weren't fighting over the real money. It was just like this weird
No,
quirky thing that,
it's
like, that was just, to them, was him.
exactly, it's what it means. And I think it goes to show that no matter how old you are, everybody needs their parents' attention and love and conversation, and relationships really matter. So these conversations are very difficult. And depending on generationally, whether people are comfortable or not talking about money, sharing their stories. I often think that financial advisors play such a potentially significant role in facilitating these conversations. And one of the ways to do it is to do what I call an ethical will, where you get your clients, or I get my clients and families of wealth. And I just was discussing this today with a new client, starting off with just writing the story about your life and what things mean and what you want your legacy to be, what you want your relationship between your children to be, and then starting to share that story with your kids and having conversations about what things mean to them. As I said, if you've grown up with siblings, everybody's perception is their reality. What one sibling may have experienced in the same room, in the same house, with the same parents, gets experienced differently by another sibling. So having those open conversations is really important. So it allows people to have holiday dinner long after the parents are gone.
Yeah, and I think the most important part about that idea is that you're giving some context to why you're having this difficult conversation. Like, I laugh about it because, just by pure coincidence, my father-in-law is an estate planning attorney.
Oh,
And sort of the way my wife and her brother have basically already divvied all of their parents' stuff up because they literally sat down and were like, what do
right,
you want?
right.
And it was just like this hilariously direct conversation
You know what?
because
But
it's
there's
just what he
something
does.
wonderful. Yeah, it's pretty wonderful, actually. It's a gift you give your kids. And everything has a different meaning. My mom passed away a year ago, and she just wore a necklace every day. And I wanted it because she wore it every day. And so my sister and I had a long talk. One of the things we decided to do, not that there was a lot of jewelry, was to sort of share it and then give it to our kids. We just wanted the sentimental things. And we had long conversations about when she got certain things and what my dad gave her and what it might have meant, regardless of whether we liked the actual piece or not. We really just had that conversation. So there's so many stories that parents can share with their kids, adult children and grandchildren. It's a gift that you give them by having that conversation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up this idea of these long conversations that you had, because I think it's very important to realize that while it's very hard to break this ice, and I mean, it can seem ghoulish depending on sort of what your family's like. Obviously not my wife's family, but some people are less comfortable talking about that than others. But the nice thing about it is that a lot of times once you've sort of like broken the ice and broken that seal with the first conversation, it becomes a self-perpetuating thing where, you have to schedule the first one if the family's really reticent about it. But then a lot of the time they bring things up that they then will then go talk about on their own. And it starts because it brings up these emotions that they didn't even realize they were having. And it sort of kickstarts its own series of communications that the advisor no longer has to be dragging each one out.
Right. Now, the other thing is that, anyone who has brothers or sisters knows that everybody has a different personality. Everybody approaches things differently. So the other thing when facilitating conversations, I try to help them shift from judging to learning. Where one child may say, I don't want anything from mom and dad, thinks that their brother or sister could be spoiled, or a sense of entitlement, really just sort of talking about what does money mean to them? What does their inheritance mean to them? What are the things, what is important to them going forward, and trying to learn about each other, because depending at what stage the parents pass away and where their kids are in their life, they may or may not be still connected. So this is an opportunity to, if there aren't really painful, difficult old wounds and conflict that needs to be resolved, it's a great opportunity for everybody to strengthen their relationships and get closer.
Yeah, and especially it's important for advisors to realize that, particularly if you're dealing with children who are in the sort of the judgmental zone, that a lot of times resolving these conflicts is going to first lead to a little conflict, and then but it's just going to be so much less if you do it now in a controlled environment when everyone's around than if you let it fester and leave it to just come up on its own after everyone's dead.
Absolutely.
And
I
so,
have had, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I've had myself beg parents to have the conversation, and they're afraid of the conflict. And so they say, well, they can fight over it when I'm gone, which is really an unkind, selfish thing to do to your children.
that's a very common way that clients and sort of decedents, if I want to use my put on my attorney hat, will think about these things because they want to avoid it now. And they're like, I trust my kids to figure it out. It's like maybe they'll fight.
Yeah.
It's like it's going to be such a bigger fight. They don't comprehend that
Well, you said
what could be a small fight with the three of you in the same room
right,
is going to be
right.
such a much bigger fight with the two of them and you dead, and them trying
Well,
to
there's two things, right? And you said a couple of things that were so important. One, if by helping the parent, I'll just use that as an example, do what I call the ethical will and put some context to why they're creating their estate plan the way they are and what means what to them and why they're doing certain things. It's the first thing, it helps their kids understand. And two, it needs to be a series of conversations because it will bring up emotion and pain. And I might get the first reaction. I might feel defensive if I hear, fair and equal are not the same things. And so as a parent, they may feel that certain children need certain things or grandchildren. And I think out of respect to everyone there's ways to have these conversations separately first and then together perhaps, and trying to explain. It only makes me think of the show Succession, which I recently binge watched during this COVID. It's so convoluted if you don't have honest, open conversations.
No, I love that you brought up Succession because as silly and sort of high drama as that show is, like a lot of that's like it's kind of in the same way that I like to think of this show, in that sort of as silly and high drama the stories we present are, like what's at the bottom of it is actually everyone goes through that.
Everyone, it's real. It's
Another really interesting example of that is if you've seen Knives Out, which is
yes,
sort of like
I
a comedy,
did.
cockamamie, dark comedy
Right,
whodunit. Like
right.
that, as an estate planner watching that movie, I'm like, this is silly and wonderful, but also like, this is so informative if you just like pay attention to what's actually like, this is real if you look below the goofiness.
It is real. And that, and it again, I tell people, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Relationships are relationships. And children always want their parents' approval, always, even from the grave. So if I feel that you didn't respect me and give me, or you gave somebody more, I watch sibling rivalry in the families that I work with that are working in business together. It's that jealousy that goes on is very real.
Well, I'm glad I think we'll transfer that to the next part of the conversation, right? Is that up till now we've kind of been talking about, I guess, for lack of a better term, sort of prophylactic approaches, right? Where you want to
Right.
try to nip these things in the bud before they turn into a thing. Unfortunately, that's not possible all the time. Sometimes you get a client and it's already a thing. So
Right.
what can you do then as an advisor to try to resolve these conflicts?
Well, I think there's two types of conflicts. There's a simple conflict and there's a complicated conflict. And the difference is a simple conflict is sort of you understand the variables. They're pretty, like I said, they're not complex. You sort of know what the issues are. There's not a long, complicated history. It's happening in the here and the now, either in the working setting or in the relationship between siblings. The more complicated kind of a conflict is when you have a long, long history. Mom always liked you best. It happened from the time we were 8 and 10. We were always fighting. We never liked each other. Now we're adults and we still don't like each other for a whole list of personality differences and situational things. I think an advisor first needs to try to understand what are the issues and start off trying to figure out what are the things that you might want to talk about in a family meeting and you want to set yourself up to win. And so try to not make it too complicated and try to make it a little more positive. And in your initial interviews, which I always recommend, if an advisor thinks they're going to put together a family meeting and try to facilitate that, you interview everybody separately to find out what their issues are so you can be prepared and not caught off guard. And if they're a complicated history, then you might want to, at that point, bring in some kind of family business consultant who can help you with that conversation.
Absolutely. And, just like everyone, every individual client in a family sort of he brings their own baggage, right? They have their own, reason for the conflict. They also, a lot of them are going to have different ways, preferred ways of resolving the conflict. And so
Absolutely.
How do you sort of reconcile the sort of various ways that people, once you've identified the problem, now you have to figure out how they want you to fix it.
Right. Well, in my relationships with families of wealth and family businesses, I have long-term relationships where I'm on retainer and I'm helping them work through identified issues and problems. So part of what makes my job a little easier, and hopefully maybe advisors can do this as well if they're having depth, is I'm developing a relationship with each family member and understanding them and hopefully getting their trust. So there are dynamics that go on. I think we had talked earlier about one of the articles I wrote. If you have a very high intense, one child is sort of more the type A and very competing, and they're only concerned about their own agenda and getting things done, they might balance out with another sibling who avoids or just accommodates to sort of get by and not have conflict and doesn't want to start. And so you're trying to move them towards compromising and collaborating by helping them find a common goal. And that's why having parents alive can be really helpful, because I've worked with families when it took me a long time, but they could finally see the pain. I worked with this one family. There were 4 siblings, and the father died unexpectedly. And we were working on succession planning in a very successful business. And long story short, it went into litigation where the 3 sisters were suing the one brother. And I was working with the attorney and the family, trying to help them negotiate. We were 1 year of meetings and trying to compromise. And I could not get these siblings to get on the same page. So I finally got the mom, who was about 80 at the time and originally from Eastern Europe and sort of very overwhelmed what was going on in her family, to write an ethical will and to really tell her kids what it meant to her if they could have a relationship, have Christmas together with their father. And she wrote this beautiful letter, which was hard for her, about how they started the business in their garage and what their values were. She was so uncomfortable doing this, she asked me to read it. So I read it at this meeting with the attorneys and all the kids, the adult children, and they were shocked. They'd never heard their mother discuss her feelings. Their father, who had died suddenly, never shared any of these stories. They settled within the week, just by her being communicating in a powerful way what she really wanted out of all this. And her goal was just that they could have holiday dinners together and figure this out. So they were highly motivated because it meant them, something to them to make her happy. And they were so happy to get her feelings on the topic, because it was very difficult for her to communicate at that level.
Yeah, and it's easy for us as advisors when we're sitting in one of these meetings to kind of forget, because ostensibly we're staring at a group of adults, right? Even when a lot of the time we're talking about children here, we're talking about 45-year-old children.
Right.
But so it's like you're looking at a group of adults, but like it's still parents and kids, and kids still put their parents on pedestals and idolize them and have these, You know what I mean? There's still like a certain
Absolutely.
idealized version of that parent where like little things from them mean stuff, and preconceived notions of them being invincible. And like these things can still persist even once everyone is sort of into,
100%.
into senior citizenship almost.
You know what? You never, I always say that every relationship is a power struggle, subtly or not so subtly. And there are three relationships that will never be equal. One is employer employee, because they can fire you. One is teacher student, they can fail you. And one is parent child. And you will always be in a position with your parents, no matter how much you. I met with a man this morning who's very wealthy gentleman who's looking at his succession planning and next phase of his life. And his mom passed away when he was 6, and his dad, he grew up in England and went to boarding schools, and he hadn't spoken to his dad for years before he died. And today, that was the number one thing he wanted to talk about was his parents and that some of those unresolved feelings. And all the money in the world hasn't really put that piece to rest in his life.
Yeah,
So
and
I think it's
it sounds so cliche, right? That it's like, oh my God, I have parent issues. But it's like it's so easy for us to look at adults and think like, oh my God, my parents screwed me up so bad and they were so perfect. But it's like, well, no, their parents screwed them up so bad. They didn't have any idea what they were doing either. Like
you
it's
know
so
what?
hard for a
It's
lot of
so
kids to look at them as
true.
people who also don't have a clue.
We all make mistakes, and so our parents make mistakes. We'll make mistakes parenting. And I'm not into being a victim. I used to tell people when I was a therapist, like, let's not be professional victims here. But I am into looking at your past if it helps you understand who you are today, and then the big so what? Where am I going? And how am I going to use that information? What's my vision going forward? And how can I get there? So I think understand, the gift you give your children, if you're willing to have, and as an advisor, people are always looking for that trusted advisor. It's hard for people to trust. And if you can offer that something special where you're not afraid of conflict and you're willing to go into some messy conversations about your money and what it means to you, how you view money. This guy was telling me today, he was from England, grew up very wealthy. His father didn't believe in giving him money, so he gave him $1,000 when he died. And he didn't even want to take it because the message of growing up is, I owe you nothing. It had nothing to do with how much money they have. They grew up very aristocratically. And so understanding how your family feels about money at an early age and talking about it can really help families stay connected, or it can help them separate if you don't have those conversations.
Yeah, and that's also just a really interesting conversation to have because I think you can talk to 15 different experts and get 15 different opinions on when's the right time to tell the kids about the money. Do you ever tell them? It's like one of those questions in this industry that it seems like there's like just no answer to.
Well, I think parents' biggest fear is if there's a lot of money, the children won't be motivated to
Yeah, one of
work
those
or have the
trust fund
values
kids,
that
right?
they had. Right. But that starts early on, those values. I've watched really wealthy people still working, because it's about the meaning it has in their life and it's about their values. It's not just about the dollars. So I believe those conversations happen really early on, and you're a role model, and it's how you live your life and what you show your kids, what you talk to your kids about. It's not and yes, there are some unforeseen things that happen in families, but it's not an accident when you get adult children who work hard and have good values. It's usually
Yeah,
because those
absolutely.
kinds of things were talked about. So again, it's never too early to have these kinds, and particularly if you have a lot of money, you can talk about stewardship, responsibility, philanthropy, giving back to the community. If you are lucky enough to be born with money and be passing along money, that it's even more important to have that conversation. I think to not prepare your children because of your fears is unfortunate. And again, a financial advisor, if they're confident enough, can have these kinds of conversations with their clients.
Yeah, and it's also like important. Just it's a matter of respect almost. Like
Hmm.
kids, no matter what you think about them, actual kids this time, not 45-year-old kids, although maybe 45-year-old kids too, they're not stupid. So like they have eyes and ears. They know
Hmm.
when they go to their friend's birthday party that, oh, this house is different than my house. When we go on a trip, we
Exactly.
take our plane as opposed to I went to my friend's, on the trip with my
Uh,
friend's family and we flew coach. Like they're
right.
getting this information eventually. And it's
Yep.
just up to you. It's your job where you can really mold that information and actually like help them process it and give it to them in a way that is controlled and helpful, as opposed to just letting them stumble into it and notice it as they notice it.
It's a very interesting point you make, and I can think of many, many examples. I grew up with a friend who is very wealthy, and I kind of knew she was different because you went to her house, and at that time she had a tennis court and a pool and boats, and so you sort of figured it out. And her family name on a lot of universities, buildings, and she ran the family foundation. And I did ask her at one point, when did you figure out you were wealthy? At what point? And she said, that's so interesting. I didn't realize I was wealthy till I went to college, because I grew up in I had such good friends, and we had such good family friends who didn't have her money. I didn't have, my family didn't. And it wasn't about that. She said, but when I went to college, I started to realize, oh, I am really different than other people. But I think, and it was hard for her to trust people trying to figure that out. So it doesn't do you any favors to not understand the situation you're in and the impact it has on your life to prepare you.
Yeah, this college example is really wonderful because, again, it makes me think of my wife, who grew up upper middle class, not wealthy, unfortunately. Right. Didn't hit the lottery there. But she grew up upper middle class in Flint, Michigan. And then when she went to the University of Michigan, on her floor were a bunch of other upper middle class kids from New York City. And so
I went to Michigan. I had that same experience. Go Blue. Yeah.
And so, I didn't even know that. See, that's wonderful. So
funny.
She had this culture shock of being like, oh, these are very different people.
So that's funny that you said. I grew up in Miami, and I went to Michigan, and I'll give away my age. A lot of people from Florida didn't go to Michigan, and I met all these other people from the suburbs of Chicago and Detroit and New York, and I was in culture shock as well. I was like, wow, I just think I hadn't been exposed to those values. I have one family I worked with. They're fifth generation international company. Their name is on the football stadium that I just recently saw a game. And I worked with the son, third generation son, who was really struggling. His dad was the current CEO and of the third wife of this guy. And he said to me, and this sounds so bizarre, but he said, growing up, I flew out on the family plane. We have 4 homes around the world. I lived this amazing life. And at the time I started working with him, specifically, he was 30. He said, nobody told me that when I turned 21, it was all going to turn off and I had to get a job and support myself. And he lived very meagerly. I mean, they had distributions of their money, but the expectations were where you put that money. So it didn't really affect his life. His siblings all worked in the company and lived a much more luxurious lifestyle. And he could not find his way. And he said so much frustration. He said, I just wasn't prepared. So they never talked about it, which I find fascinating.
That's the other side of that. That's the other side of that preparation coin. Like if you avoid that conversation for so long, try to not create a trust fund kid, you effectively create a lottery winner. And then that's just as bad. They're going to not know what to do with that money either. So
right. It's a very complicated conversation, but it has to happen. And you take complex ideas and you break them down to simple steps. And it starts with trusting a family, which is hard, particularly if you have families of wealth, to trust an outsider. I like to think of myself as an outside member of the family or outside member of the company, and a financial advisor that is willing to learn these skills and really trying to understand these concepts and how to have these conversations. They'll be invaluable to a family because, you need somebody to guide, someone objective to guide these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we're running long here. This has been such an interesting conversation, and we've gone off in so many different directions that we've lost track of time a little bit, but that's a wonderful problem to have. But I would like to wrap things up and to thank our guest, Dr. Denise Federer, for being a fantastic guest. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This is great.
And for all our listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of InformaWealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.